You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Shalom, welcome to this week's SLA Insights. I'm Dr. Jennifer Noonan, and I'm going to continue this discussion of structured input and structured input activities. But to do so, let me back up just a little bit to do a quick review on what we've been covering. We're looking at ways to increase the quality of comprehensible input for language students, helping them to overcome their limited resources, limited working memory, and to manipulate the input in such a way as to help them really focus in on the target structure, what it is you're trying to help them learn. So this is within the context of what's known as processing instruction, created by Bill Van Patten and Teresa Cadierno. And it's a way of doing this, of helping the students focus on the target structure. It's called an intervention. It's not a method or a full language learning approach, but something you would use within that to really target a specific form to help your students learn that well. There are three components of processing instruction: explicit grammar information, information about default natural processing strategies that students have to help them overcome that. And that's something I covered a few weeks ago. And then the structured input activities themselves, which are definitely the most important component of this intervention. So I've been looking at the different guidelines of how you create structured input, how to do it well. And today I'm going to cover the fourth one. But to give us a running start, I'm going to quickly review the first three and then go into detail a little bit more about the fourth one. So the first guideline for creating structured input activities is 1, present one thing at a time, 2, keep meaning in focus, and 3, move from sentences to connected discourse. So the students are learning the form, the target structure, not just isolated or in short sentences, but moving into more extended dialogue or story. And so the fourth guideline then, which we'll be talking about today, is to look to use both oral and written input. And you want to do this for several reasons. First of all, understand that language input, comprehensible input, which is understood as essential for language acquisition, is language, target language that the learner receives. And it can be either oral or written. If we look at the 4 language skills, speaking, listening, reading, writing, the input skills are listening and reading. So we have oral input for listening, written input for reading. And there's a rationale for this, several rationales. One is you want to cover both types of input in the sense of provides completeness. You're addressing both input-related skills. But there are other reasons as well. One of them is just you're going to be working with different types of language learners. Those who have a preference for auditory are going to do better with the oral input. Those who are more visual are going to do better with the written input. So you're targeting the full range, at least within input, the full range of learners who are going to be gathering the input. But then also, and this is important and something I'm going to cover later in the podcast series about reading, because reading is sub-vocalization. Even if you are reading silently to yourself, your brain is still hearing the language. And so it's really important to develop our auditory skills, even if we're only going to be reading the text. And again, I'll address this later in the podcast series, but be aware that doing oral input, even for a dead language that you'll only be reading, is not wasted time. It's important for developing those auditory skills so you can hear the language as you're reading it. So, by way of a practical example, just to piggyback on the previous episode where we were talking about using the third person masculine singular Hebrew perfect or katal form, we were looking at the sentence, Mi bana et habayit, who built the house? And then you could answer David bana et habayit, David built the house. We were moving from sentences to extended dialogue. But using that same example, we can also use that both as oral input and as written input. It's quite possible in a classroom setting to ask your students who built the house, or whatever the verb form is that you're using, and to elicit some back and forth or expand on it. Who built the temple? Who built the tower? Or whatever. And so creating dialogue, auditory, oral input for your students in the context of a classroom. It's also possible to give them some pre-recorded, but they're less likely to stay focused if they aren't required an answer. So those are some things to consider. So that would be oral or auditory input. In terms of written input, it's possible to create a story about, say, David and his building projects. David built a house. David built a palace. David built a tower. But David did not build the temple. So a very simple story that can help the students, once again, have the repetition, focus on the input, and focus on it in different context, in an auditory context, in a written context, to further develop their understanding of this word. And the other thing is, and this is one more rationale, when you have a particular memory in your brain, say the memory of the third person masculine singular Hebrew verb form, you have various memory traces, ways of accessing that memory, how you get to it. If you only have one trace to the memory, it's going to be a lot harder to access it than if you have multiple traces, an auditory trace, a visual trace, a trace of, oh, I heard it in this context, oh, I said it in this context. The more memory traces you have, the more likely you are to access it, especially if one of those traces gets blocked in some way or another. So, by way of review, this was the fourth guideline for creating structured input activities. So what you're doing is, in this guideline, is using both oral and written input. And again, these guidelines, many of them can be useful for other types of input as well, not just structured input. So feel free to borrow and expand on them. So the fourth of the six guidelines. The first one was present one thing at a time. Second one, keep meaning in focus. Third one, move from sentences to connected discourse. And then today, the fourth, use both oral and written input as you're developing your activities. And the goal then, as I've been saying, is to improve the quality of input, to keep it focused, targeted, so that the students can more quickly and efficiently acquire the language. Next episode, I'm going to continue with the fifth guideline. I hope you can join me for that one, and I ask that you have a great week.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House. Language resources for the global community.